Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. I got to say thanks to our sponsor, Sheba Coffee and Tea Co., for fueling up today's exploration. We're going deep into a topic that I think you're going to find fascinating. It kind of has this blend of history and law, and maybe even a little bit of, swashbuckling adventure. We're talking about letters of marque.
Letters of Marque. Yeah, that's a phrase that might sound like it's straight out of a pirate movie.
Right.
But these government-issued licenses, they allowed private citizens to capture enemy ships, and they have a history that goes way back centuries. We're talking a long time.
Exactly. And that's what I think is so cool about this deep dive. I mean, we're not just going to, kind of skim the surface. We're going to really look at how these letters of marque worked back in the day, why they were eventually done away with. And then here's where I think it gets really interesting.
Okay, yeah.
Could they actually be relevant again, like in the 21st century? I mean, could this be a thing again?
Yeah, you've got a whole stack of sources there, right?
Yeah.
Everything from historical accounts to, modern-day legal analysis. We even got some spiced contemporary political commentary thrown in.
All right, so let's jump into this.
Yeah.
To set the stage, can you give us a quick rundown of what letters of marque were and how they fit into the bigger picture of, maritime history, way back when?
Okay, so imagine way back before you had these big standing navies, the norm, governments, especially those that didn't have a ton of naval power, they would issue these letters of marque to private ship owners, essentially deputizing them to go out and wage naval warfare on their behalf.
So these weren't just, random pirates out there plundering ships just for their own personal gain. They were actually operating with some degree of government backing. Right.
Exactly. That's a really important point. And the Wikipedia entry that you have there actually highlights this. Even in those early days, there were definitely attempts to regulate this whole practice. Privateers working under these letters of marque had to follow certain rules of engagement.
So they couldn't just attack any ship they came across, right?
Right. They had to have targets, vessels that their government was actually at war with.
Gotcha.
And they were required to bring any captured ships, the prizes, as they were called, before these admiralty courts who would decide, was this capture actually legal? And then, how would the spoils be divided up, all that.
So there was a legal system in place, even if it seems a little rough around the edges compared to what we're used to today.
It was a system that came out of necessity and opportunity, really. For governments, it was a pretty cost-effective way to fight wars at sea without having to spend a fortune to build and maintain these massive fleets of ships.
Sounds like outsourcing your Navy.
Exactly. And for the privateers themselves, it was a chance to make some money off of wartime activities. You could turn naval warfare into a pretty lucrative business if you were good at it.
And talk about lucrative, that example you gave from Guernsey during the American Revolution. Those privateers from this tiny little island, they captured ships and cargo worth something like 900,000 pounds.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling.
I mean, that's got to be close to $1 billion in today's money, right?
It's an insane amount of money for the time.
It really makes you wonder, did those early privateers, think of themselves as patriotic heroes? Or were they more like shrewd entrepreneurs just taking advantage of all the chaos of war?
That's a debate historians still have today, And it's important to remember that over time, the lines between letters of marque and privateering commissions, which were often given to dedicated warships, those lines got blurrier and blurrier.
And you mentioned earlier that even merchant vessels could be given these letters of marque. Was that mostly for self-defense, or did that also open the door for them to just grab some prizes if the opportunity came up?
I'd say it was both, really. Take the East India Company, for example. They often had cannons on their merchant ships and armed crews. It was all about protecting themselves from pirates and rival trading companies, of course. But they were also known to engage in a bit of privateering when the chance arose.
So you can just picture it, right? You're a merchant captain sailing from London to India, loaded down with spices and textiles, and you come across a French ship. What do? Stick to your trade route, or see this as a chance to maybe turn a profit by capturing an enemy vessel? I mean, it had to be tempting, right?
So absolutely, and it gives you a glimpse into the mindset of the people operating within this system. They were balancing commercial interests with national loyalties with all the risks of maritime warfare. It's a fascinating period of history.
It is, and it's a system that, even though it was around for centuries, It eventually kind of fell out of favor. What happened? What led to the decline and then the ultimate abolition of these letters of marque?
The big turning point was the 1856 Paris Declaration. This was a big international agreement signed by a lot of the major powers, and it basically outlawed privateering as a legitimate way to fight a war.
But hold on, didn't you mention that the U.S. never actually signed that declaration?
That's right, we didn't.
So does that mean, at least in theory, we could still issue letters of marque today?
That's a question that's sparking some debate these days, especially with all the modern challenges the U.S. is facing, things like drug trafficking and cybersecurity threats.
Yeah, it gets even more interesting because we're not just looking at, some historical relic here. There are people today actually arguing for bringing back letters of marque as a way to tackle some of the serious threats we're up against in the world.
So not just like, swashbuckling pirates chasing after Spanish galleons anymore.
Right, exactly. We're talking modern problems, drug cartels, cyber attacks, even maritime disputes with countries like China.
It's pretty wild to think about. So, could letters of marque, if we set them up with the right rules and safeguards, could they actually work to deal with these threats? Or are we going to end up opening up this can of worms with all these legal and ethical headaches?
It's a tough question. And, the Center for Maritime Strategy article that you found that really lays out a good argument for how this old practice could be updated for the 21st century. Okay, so let's start with the legal side of things. If the U.S. never technically got rid of privateering, does that mean, Congress could just start handing out letters of marque tomorrow?
It's not quite that easy. While the Constitution does give Congress the power to issue letters of marque, there are a lot of legal experts who say that it's basically forbidden by the treaties we've signed and customary international law.
So even though we never officially put our name on the Paris Declaration, we're still bound by those international rules.
That's the main argument, and it brings up some really tricky questions about how our domestic laws and international commitments work together.
Sounds like there'd be a lot of legal hoops to jump through before we'd ever see a modern-day privateer sailing around with a letter of marque.
Oh, for sure. And even if we somehow got over all those legal obstacles, there are some serious practical and ethical issues to think about, too.
Like what? Give me an idea of what kind of problems we could run into.
Well, first off, who would these modern privateers even be? Are we talking about private military companies, security firms, or just some random folks with a boat and a thirst for adventure?
Yeah, and how do we make sure they're playing by the rules?
Yeah.
It's not hard to imagine situations where things get out of control. Private actors overstepping their boundaries or even doing straight-up illegal stuff.
That's a huge concern, and the Center for Maritime Strategy report really stresses how important it is to have crystal clear rules of engagement, strong oversight, and ways to hold people accountable to prevent those abuses and make sure everyone's sticking to international law.
Okay, but who would be in charge of all that oversight?
Yeah.
And what if a privateer does commit a crime or causes some collateral damage? Who takes the blame for that?
These are all critical questions that we'd have to figure out before we even think about using letters of marque as a real option.
And this is just hypothetical. We've seen some concrete proposals for using letters of marque today, right?
Yeah, Senator Mike Lee, like you mentioned in your research, he's been pushing for using letters of marque to go after drug cartels operating across the U.S.-Mexico border.
Right. His proposal, that was in the Washington Examiner article, he wants to give letters of marque to private security companies, letting them intercept drug shipments, seize their assets, even arrest cartel members.
It's a bold idea for sure, and it's gotten some big names on board. You mentioned Elon Musk and Donald Trump Jr. They seem to be interested.
But it also raises some big red flags. Would these private contractors be under the control of the U.S. military? Or would they be acting on their own, potentially making conflicts worse and causing diplomatic problems?
Right.
You know.
And then there's the whole problem of mission creep. Once you give private companies the power to use force, how do you keep them from taking things too far?
Yeah, it feels like a slippery slope for sure. And it's not just about drug cartels either. That Center for Maritime Strategy report also looks at the possibility of using letters of marque to deal with cyber attacks, especially those coming from countries like China.
Now that's where things get really interesting and maybe even a little scary.
Because now we're talking about giving private companies permission to carry out offensive cyber operations, basically a license to hack back.
Exactly. And the implications of that are huge. How do you keep those activities under control? How do you make sure they don't accidentally cause damage in the digital world?
And what if these private cyber warriors go after the wrong server or unleash some kind of malware that gets totally out of hand?
These are the kinds of unintended consequences that keep cybersecurity experts awake at night.
So on one hand, we've got this historical tool that could maybe be tweaked to meet the challenges we face today. But on the other hand, there are all these legal, ethical, practical worries that are really hard to solve.
It's a tough situation to be in, and it forces us to think deeply about what warfare really is, the role of private actors in national security, and whether our legal and ethical frameworks can keep up with this rapidly changing world.
So it feels like we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place with this whole letters of marque thing. Do we have to bring this back from the past and make it work for the 21st century, or admit it's just a relic of a bygone era and leave it in the history books?
It's a question that really requires some careful thought. We've gone through the historical background, the potential upsides, and the very real risks that come with it. It all comes down to how we as a society want to deal with these tough challenges.
So if we did decide to go down this road, what kind of safeguards would we need to put in place to make sure these modern-day privateers are playing by the rules and don't abuse their power?
Well, as we've talked about, clear rules of engagement are absolutely essential. We have to define exactly what actions these private actors are allowed to take, who they can take them against, and under what specific circumstances.
And it can't just be like a list of rules on a sheet of paper,
Yeah.
right? We need strong oversight to keep an eye on what they're doing, investigate any claims of wrongdoing, and hold them accountable if they break the rules.
Right, you need that oversight to be independent and transparent with clear lines of authority and ways to report and address any concerns that come up.
It also makes you wonder about the legal side of things. Would these privateers be under U.S. military law? Or would they be operating under a different set of regulations? That could lead to some confusion and jurisdictional disputes.
Yeah, those are key legal points that would need to be ironed out beforehand. And we can't forget about how other countries would react. Even if the U.S. brought back letters of marque, other nations might not accept them as legal, which could cause diplomatic tension or even armed conflict.
Man, it seems like every time we try to get a handle on this issue, we just uncover even more complexity. It makes you wonder if the potential benefits of letters of marque are really worth all the risks.
That's the big question, isn't it? And there's no simple answer. You have to weigh how effective this approach might be against the potential for unintended consequences, both here at home and on the international stage.
Well, folks, we've taken you on a deep dive into the world of letters of marque. We've looked at their fascinating history, their controversial status today, and their uncertain future. We've examined the arguments for and against bringing them back, the ethical and legal dilemmas, and the potential risks and rewards. Now it's time for you to decide what you think.
Definitely do your own research. Read that Center for Maritime Strategy article, Senator Lee's proposal, dive into the historical accounts. And as you're thinking about this whole complex topic, ask yourself what role, if any, should private citizens have in matters of national security?
That's a question with some really big implications for the future of warfare. The balance of power between governments and private companies, and even the very foundation of our society. And a huge thank you to Sheba Coffee and Tea Co. for keeping us going during this deep dive. Their amazing blends always keep our minds sharp and ready to tackle even the toughest topics.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those minds engaged.